So let's bring in our footage, and I'll drag that down to the new composition button to make a new composition. I'm going to put a LUT on this, so I'll go to my Effect Controls panel and put the Apply Color LUT effect on it. You can drag that in. And it'll ask us to apply a LUT, and just go ahead and put on the LUT. There we go, now we can see it in color. But we want to put this LUT on its own layer so that we can turn it on and off more easily. So I'm going to do Control-Alt-Y to make an adjustment layer, and I'll Control-X to cut, and Control-V to paste. So now this LUT is on an adjustment layer, and if I set this to a guide layer, it won't render, but it will show in our viewport here. So now we got our footage in, let's bring in our two CG pieces of footage, two CG assets. We've got the render, which is the main robot, and then we've also got a matte. And this is, we're going to use this to separate the foreground and the background, because these arms here go in front of our character, but this large arm behind it stays behind him. So we need to create that separation so that we can put our character in between those two layers. So let's bring in our render, and you can just drag it on top of your footage, but make sure it's underneath your LUT adjustment layer. So let's start to color correct our render a little bit to fit inside of our composition better. So first thing we want to do is set our black and white points with levels. So just drag this one up, drag the black point up a little bit and the white point down until it matches your footage. And the main thing we need to do here is roto this character to be in front of our robot. So let's duplicate our footage layer with Control-D. We'll put that on top of our CG render, and we'll enter the roto brush tool. So it's just this one up here, and you can double click on your layer to go into the layer window. And it's just showing us the footage without the LUT on it, and that's why we're not seeing it colored anymore. And you can make your roto brush larger and smaller with Control, click and hold, and drag. So set your brush to the size you want, and then just start painting over your character. And don't worry too much about the hair, because we can refine that. So just get the general shape going for your character. And it's everything that we want to show up in front of the robot. So not the background here. And if you hold Alt and click, you can deselect. And I'm just clicking and dragging. So now I'm Alt clicking and dragging to deselect. And once your selection's looking pretty good, we're just going to hit spacebar. We're going to hit play. Actually, no. Before we do that, so once you get your general outline good, we want to refine this hair up here. And for that, we'll go to the Refine Edge tool by clicking and holding on the roto brush and going to Refine Edge. And then we'll just trace along the outside of the roto where our hair is. And be careful with this brush stroke, because it's going to kind of be glued to your roto brush edge. And here it's using kind of a contrast blend mode to roto the hair here, which does a really nice job. I'm seeing a little pole back here, so I'm going to Alt click and drag to deselect that pole, so we're just getting the hair. And so now that I got my first frame looking good, I'm just going to hit play or spacebar and let this start going forward. And roto brush is pretty good at detecting the edges throughout the entire clip, but if you need to, you can stop along the way and make adjustments. It's looking pretty good so far. Okay, so that's finished. It's gone the whole way through. I'll just watch it through. And I'm seeing some glitchiness happening down here, but the robot's not covering that area, so I'm just going to leave that. But you could go back and fix that if you want on those frames. So now that my roto's looking good, this is a really important step, is to hit this freeze button here, and that will bake in all the data so that you don't have to regenerate this the next time you open the project. Okay, so we've got our roto on top of our render. Now that's looking really cool. We can see he's in front, and the hair did a pretty good job as well. So let's name this layer roto. Okay, he's the right size now. So let's add our levels effect. Bring up the darkness a bit. Bring up the black point and bring down the white point until your levels are looking pretty good. Maybe try adjusting the gamma a little bit. That's the center triangle until you get something you're happy with. I think I'll also bring down the saturation a bit. For that, I'll use Lumetri. Well, before I do that, let's first. So we've got our roto on top of our CG render. So we also want, on certain frames, for the robot to now be in front of our character. So let's make another layer duplicating our CG render, drag that on top of our roto, and instead of rotoing this arm right here, we've already made the matte for it. So let's bring in our CG matte layer, and here we've got that outline. You can toggle it on and off to make sure it's lined up correctly. And so we want to use this to drive our matte. So if you go down to track matte right here on the CG render layer, change your track matte from none to Luma matte, and that will read the black and white values in the CG matte layer and apply it as a matte. And it also turns off the CG matte layer, so we're not seeing this black and white image anymore, but the layer beneath it is reading the layer above it and cutting out itself based on the black and white values. So we've got our foreground layer, and I'll name that. So we've got our foreground robot, we've got our roto, we've got our robot behind the roto, and we've got our footage behind all of that. So it looks like some of our CG foreground we don't want here because this is getting in front of our roto here. So I actually want to adjust this. So I want the foreground to start right about on this frame. So I'll trim my matte and my foreground layer together to start on this frame. So now on the frame before, there's nothing in front, and on the frame after, these things are now in front of him. Cool. So the next thing we got to do is add motion blur to this robot. And that wasn't rendered in 3D, and usually that's done in compositing and not in 3D. So let's just grab our CG. Now this is going to be tricky because we've got the foreground to deal with too, so we'll have to do this twice. So let's pre-comp our foreground matte. So let's grab our foreground CG and our matte, and we'll group these together with a pre-comp. So Control-Shift-C to pre-comp, and we'll call this our CG foreground, and we'll move all attributes. And so now if we isolate this layer, it's just one layer with the matte already applied. And so on this, we can apply our motion blur. So we'll search for pixel motion blur. And just put that on there. And that blurs, and that adds a blur wherever there's some extreme movement. It looks okay. I think we could use some more samples, so I'll bring this up to 8. That's looking a little smoother. And let's unisolate this so we can see how it looks in our shot. And you'll see we just have this on the foreground. We don't have this on the background robot. Which I think is fine. Toggling on and off this background layer just shows a little crisper edge, which you might not want. So you could apply, let's apply our pixel motion blur to our background CG as well. Hey, I'm just going to trim the end of this video to before the hairdryer starts moving down. So I'll just drag my work area down, back a few frames. So this looks really good with the motion blur. Now let's just add some hair particles flying around as he's getting his hair cut. So I'm going to start that right there. We'll make a new solid with Control Y, call it Particles. And we'll add the CC Particle World effect on top of it. And I'm going to isolate this layer just so we can see what we're working with. So these are our particles that are emitting from our emitter, and we want this to look like hair. So let's see what we can do here. So we don't want them to be gold. Let's make them a little brown, and actually this is where I'll sample the color of his hair. So let me unisolate this layer, and I'll hit my eyedropper and select birth color and death color, and this is just kind of over time, so I'll have it get a little bit darker over time. So there's the brown color. We don't want them to be lines, we want them to be, this is where you can just kind of start to play with this to see what looks good. Probably faded sphere. And what's also going to help this a lot is the motion blur. So if I go down to extras and, to turn on motion blur, let's enable motion blur for all layers, and we have to also toggle our switches and modes right down here, or you can hit F4 to switch between these modes, and we want to hit the motion blur button right here. And so with motion blur enabled on our particles layer and motion blur enabled in our comp, we'll see our motion blur on our particle. So now we can have a little better preview of what these look like. So probably not try, let's try faded sphere, and then I'll move my emitter up to where his head is. And it should also be much smaller. The particles should die sooner. We don't want them going all the way to the ground. I just want them kind of flying around in this, around his head. So I'll decrease the longevity here to about 0.2. Let's see how that's looking. Okay, we're getting somewhere. This also has to be behind his head. So let's put this behind our roto layer. And thankfully we already did the roto. So now the particles are just flying behind his head. And we want them to only start and stop when the robot's spinning. So let's keyframe our emitter to start on this frame. There's a stopwatch next to birth rate. And on the frame before, we can just hit page up to go one frame before. And now we'll set the birth rate to 0. And if you hit U while selecting your layer, it'll show you the keyframes that you have. So I've got birth rate at 0, and then one frame later the birth rate is at 2. So on this frame it'll start emitting, and then we also want it to stop emitting on a certain frame right about there, right when the robot stops spinning. So I'll set another keyframe on birth rate, and I can just hit add keyframe at the current value, and then we'll change it to 0. Oh, but see, I didn't go one frame later, so let me undo that. So we're at 2, and then I'll do page down to get to my next frame, and then I'll set my birth rate to 0, which sets a keyframe. So now it will stop emitting on this frame. Alright, so those are the basics of this comp. Putting your CG layer in with your live action footage. You guys can animate the robot however you want and comp this however you want. And once you're happy with it, we're going to render it out. So we'll do Control M to send it to the render queue. We'll set our render settings. So you have to set your output location first. And I'll just choose my folder here. Call this, put your name on it, and give it a version number. And then you want to queue it in AME. You can render it as ProRes 4x4 if you want to keep it really high quality. This would be if you're delivering it back to an editor. But since we just want to watch these, we're going to export these as H.264. So once Media Encoder opens, set your type to H.264. High bitrate is fine, and then our output file should already be set from After Effects. So hit the green play button to render that, and drop that in the turn-in folder.